surrender, and what happens when God teaches us lessons in the most unexpected of places, like Guantanamo Bay. From floor plans to 5-year plans, business to finding balance, I'm Ashley Bruggeman, an interior designer with a love for beautiful living and a belief that style and substance go hand in hand. I'm pulling back the curtain on design, resilience, and entrepreneurship. Expect real talk, refined tips, and just the right mix of polish and personality. So pour something sweet and join me for a thoughtful conversation with a generous helping of charm and circumstance. I love to have control. I imagine you might just as well. Control over situations, plans, experiences, people, myself, finances, relationships, need I go on. My therapist would frequently point out my attempts to control situations, to which I would respond, and why wouldn't I? Who wouldn't want to have control? I've learned the answer to that question is likely the people who have come to understand that they're not actually in control, and the freedom that comes with this kind of mindset. Our attempts to be in control are reasonable considering what we face daily. Between juggling careers, families, commitments, and the general responsibilities that come with just being an adult, we often default to control as a way to feel safe, but maybe you've realized that we're never actually in control. For crying out loud, we can't even control ourselves half the time. I don't remember the specifics of what led to the realization of my issues with control, but several years ago, something led me to pray for help with the urge to grasp for control with every aspect of my life. One of those prayers where you know something needs to change, but you can't imagine how on earth even God could accomplish it. I've had several experiences like this, and in true form, God answers the prayer uniquely and in the absolute most unexpected way. So my brother recently retired from the Navy, and he was blessed to be stationed all over the world, gaining super cool experiences. But of course, every now and then, he ended up stationed in places like Guantanamo Bay. So this military base is well known because of the reputation it earned after 9/11, when captured terrorists were shipped to Gitmo, imprisoned, and tortured. It's located in Cuba, but it's basically American land and is completely walled off from the rest of Cuba. If you fly into the base, you cannot leave and enter into Cuba, and in the same way, no one can enter the base from Cuba. There are, of course, special circumstances when this happens for very few people, but I won't bore you with those details. The point here is there's basically a wall with Marines standing on that wall, protecting all of us. Okay, that's a joke, but not really. It's also from the well-known movie A Few Good Men, which is taking place at Gitmo. I thought I wanted to experience this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see a place I'd never again have the chance to see so soon after my brother moved there. So I decided to start the visit request process, which, as you can imagine, is a whole big thing. The timing worked out so that going there over spring break was the best time for us. So I took my son there for spring break, because, what cool mom wouldn't want to take their kid to Gitmo for spring break? And I can't begin to tell you how much my son loved anything military related at the time. He was in middle school, so it seemed like a great idea. So because the base is landlocked like this, the only way in and out is on military flights that fly between naval bases in the U.S. and Gitmo. At the time I went, you had to fly out of the bases in either Jacksonville or Norfolk, Virginia, and this is where the foreshadowing of my complete lack of control begins. We flew to Jacksonville, Florida from Kentucky on Delta and cabbed to a hotel because we had to be on base there around 4 a.m. or something ridiculous like that the following morning to try to catch the military flight out. This military flight is called the Rotator because it goes back and forth between Jacksonville, Gitmo, and Norfolk. And because it is a military flight, it's used for troop movements to and from Gitmo. Obviously, actual military members get priority, and from there are about 7 or so levels of priority, including those stationed at Gitmo, media, etc., with visitors like my son and I ranking last. Meaning we were at the very bottom of the list to get a seat on that Rotator flight, and we wouldn't know if it was going to happen until we were actually walking onto the plane. The Rotator only flew out of Jacksonville once a week, so this was our only shot, and there was no way we knew what our chances were going to be. As I think about this, I'm actually shocked I was even willing to take this risk. This is so out of character for me. If we hadn't made it on that flight, I'd have spent money flying to Jacksonville and on hotels for absolutely nothing. I can remember sitting in that flight terminal like it was yesterday. My stomach was in knots. I was so nervous it might not work out and so fearful of disappointing James after coming all this way. Needless to say, much to my relief, we made it on the flight. And as a reminder of my so-called rank in the situation, to match our priority standing and boarding, we sat in the very back of the plane, like a warning sign of what was to come. My spring break trip was about to turn into quite a bit more. Once we landed, we experienced more waiting around. Now, if you're in the military, or former military, married into the military, or you were raised in it, you know the hurry up and wait adage and accepted it because, well, you had no other choice. As a civilian who was never tempted to join the military because I'm dangerously independent, a hurry up and wait environment is a quick way to land me in jail. Which is why this episode is about my control issues. So Gitmo is about 20,000 acres of land that wraps around Guantanamo Bay, an actual bay of water. The airstrip on the base is on one side of the bay, while everything else is on the other side of the bay. So to add to the inconvenience, you have to catch a ferry across the bay, which runs about every few hours. We had just missed the ferry when we landed. Have I mentioned that we got up at like 2 a.m. that morning? It did work out that a United Nations rep was about to give a tour to the IG, or the Inspector General, of the land the UN had on base to serve as housing for refugees that might be sent there from around the world. They would be set up in military tents with access to plumbing and water. So we did get to participate in this tour with the UN rep and the IG, and I learned a lot about how these things work that, as you might imagine, as an interior designer, I don't spend a lot of time learning about how to house thousands of people, adults and children, speaking foreign languages, as well as how the UN and participating nations make all this work. So eventually, we caught the ferry to begin the next leg of the Gitmo experience. While we were there, we tried a bit of everything that Gitmo has to offer. The gym, the golf course, which is 100% dirt, the 4 or so restaurants that all had basically the same menu, the pool, which was run by some very talented Jamaicans who impressed us daily with their water aerobic skills, and drives through the Cuban countryside surrounding the prison and the rocky beaches that overlooked the most gorgeous of sunsets. Oh, and the iguanas. You can't mention Gitmo without mentioning the iguanas. They're protected there, meaning you get fined some ridiculous amount of money if you hurt them, basically run over them with a car. And as it often works in nature, the iguanas are somehow aware of this protected status because at about 2 to 4 feet long, they often decide to walk out into the middle of the road and just sit until they decide you've waited long enough. And then they'll move along and let you continue on. Have I mentioned that I had no cell service in Gitmo? only T-Mobile provides service, and as luck would have it, I had Verizon. So unless I was at my brother's house or sitting inside the only fast food restaurant on base besides Subway, which was McDonald's, where there was Wi-Fi, I was out of luck, driving through the wastelands of Gitmo until I hit a perimeter where I was stopped by a Marine with a really big gun. I will also mention Camp X-Ray, which was the original and temporary prison, though really it's just cages that the prisoners were held in during the early days following 9/11. You can Google the images, but it's basically like looking at an outdoor dog kennel. It was right behind my brother's house and was still up when we were there because it remained under investigation following the controversial torture and tactics that were applied to prisoners. They built Camp Delta as the permanent prison, which is an actual building with its own security perimeter. The only way I can describe seeing Camp X-Ray in person is that it was dark and honestly difficult to look at for all that it represented, as completely and totally inhumane from both the aspect of what the terrorists who were held there did and all the lives they took, as well as the way that they were tortured. It was definitely a sobering experience. So a week later, it was finally time to pack up and go home, and we boarded the ferry to get back over to the airstrip side of the bay to catch that rotator flight back to Jacksonville. As we walked into the terminal, which is really just a one-room building, it was filled with soldiers, which was a really bad sign. It was a troop movement associated with the prison, and there were a lot of soldiers, enough to fill up the rotator, a Boeing 737. We got to the terminal early that morning, hoping to catch 2 seats on the rotator that afternoon, the whole hurry up and wait concept. And unlike a normal airport situation, we weren't customers here. We were merely civilians in a military world, meaning we were out of luck. The troops boarded the flight, and every civilian waiting was told to wait around if they wanted to see who else might land and be willing to take us back to the States. You see, before 9/11, before the prison was built, Gitmo served purely as a refueling station for U.S. aircraft and boats. This is still actually its purpose, though the prison brings a lot of federal funding and troop movement. They aren't necessarily sure of who or what aircraft are going to be stopping in to refuel until they're an hour or 2 out. So my biggest fear just happened. We missed our flight back into Jacksonville, where we would have landed just in time to allow us to get over to the Jacksonville airport to catch our Delta return flight, getting us home in time to get back to work and school. This was not how I planned our spring break. We made it on the rotator flight to Gitmo, so I figured it would just work out getting home. I've spent a lot of time flying through my career, and I weave strategy through any flying experience, meaning as soon as the pilot comes across the speakers to announce that our flight is canceled, even though we're already on the tarmac, I'm the first one on that Enterprise app to book my rental car because I have enough experience to know that they will run out of cars in these situations. And if flights start getting canceled, I will likely not make it out on an airplane. But you know what I can get home in? A rental car. So if I was traveling regionally, meaning like up to 10 hours or so, you'd better believe I would hop in a car to get where I wanted to go before I was going to wait around and let other people determine whether I was going to fly home. Control issues. So sitting behind the wheel is a level of control that far surpasses seat 5B, even if it means sitting behind that wheel for 10 hours straight. Have you ever been sitting in traffic and gone off on side roads because you know you'd at least be moving even though it will take you longer? Unless I practice deep breathing exercises, I will do this just about every single time. Like I said, I have control issues. So back at Gitmo, I decided we might as well wait around in that one-room concrete block construction terminal on the off chance some military flight would need to refuel and would have room for us and our luggage and be flying back into the continental U.S. and be willing to take us. We waited and we waited, and it never happened. So we boarded the ferry with all of our luggage once again and went back to the other side of the bay just to do this all again the next morning. We repeated this exact process every single day for I'm not even sure how many days because I may have blocked it out from my memory. And this is when the desperation hit. I tried tears with the guy who ran the terminal, who was former military, so he wasn't moved. I racked my brain for every single contact I had in the government. No senator, no member of Congress, no one I knew in DC had the power to influence any of this. So I sat, waiting, defeated, knowing I was now missing work. James was now missing school. I wasn't even sure how we would get back home once we landed in the US because I had no idea where we would even land when we got there. So I couldn't plan anything. I couldn't even create contingency plans. I only had control over my own thoughts. And to be honest, I wasn't doing so well in that department either. I'm pretty sure my blood pressure has gone up just reliving this. Every evening boarding the ferry with our luggage was like this epic and overwhelming barrage of defeat. It was also infuriating. Infuriating that I had zero control over the situation, and I didn't know if I had ever been in a situation where I had zero control to this level. And then one day, sitting in that terminal, I was reminded about how I had recently prayed that God would help me with my control issues. And I thought, oh no. I brought this on myself. Take it back, God. I was not prepared for him to remove all control like this, nor was anyone around me. I can't imagine what it was like to be around me during those days. And what do we do when some aspect of life is completely out of our control? Well, of course, we search frantically for anything that we can control. And to be honest, my options were very, very limited. Various flights came in and out during those days we spent waiting, various troop movements, various who knows what, because it's military and I never made it on the need to know list. So I started talking to strangers in the terminal, and just so you know, I have to typically force myself to talk to people that I don't know. I'm an extrovert, but not that type of extrovert. I'm a put headphones on and don't make eye contact unless I intentionally push myself to smile at people and willingly engage in conversation. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's the truth. So I ended up meeting a young woman who had just married a guy in the Navy who had been stationed at Gitmo, but the paperwork hadn't caught up with their newly married status. So he was living in Gitmo Bachelor Paradise. That's my name for it, of course. I don't know what it's officially called, but I'm sure whatever the military calls it isn't as fun. But it's where all the single men are housed on base, or the ones who aren't living there with families. So as opposed to those who are stationed there with wives and children, like my brother, who receive more normal housing like houses themselves. So this woman was flying down there once a month or so to visit her husband, going through this very process every single time. My mind was blown, as in, you have got to be kidding me. Well, it turned out she was a teacher, risking her job, by the way, if she couldn't get out of Gitmo to get back to work. And it just so turned out that there was a teacher shortage on base. Imagine that. I mean, what teacher wouldn't want to move to and live in this little corner of paradise? At some point, I'd met another woman on base who ran the school, and she just happened to be sitting close, waiting, of course, in that terminal at that same time. So I introduced the two. That woman's marriage wasn't Gitmo's priority or anywhere close, but a teacher shortage that probably ranked a bit higher. So at least I got a little control fix through this little matchmaking exercise. A day or two later, the terminal operator told me that a plane was landing to refuel on its way to Norfolk, and he was asking them if they'd take us, as well as the 11 other civilians trapped in this Groundhog Day nightmare. He prefaced it by saying, "Don't get your hopes up." Maybe by this point, I'd lost my fight. I had accepted defeat. I was definitely not in control. I could not work around or through anyone. The best I could do was to introduce my fellow captives, the others stuck waiting, to one another so that maybe I could embark some level of control on their lives. I was praying consistently that God would get us out of there, but I think I honestly tend to project my own personality on God, which is actually as scary as it sounds. I assumed he was teaching me a lesson the hard way, as if he was a parent in the 80s, the kind that washed your mouth out with soap or told you they'd give you a reason to cry. I couldn't have been more wrong. He had given me a once-in-a-lifetime experience to learn patience, to realize how when he took control away from me, I'd seek out and grasp to control any way I could. The example of the newly married teacher is just one of many examples of me doing this. I'll also admit that none of this occurred to me until long after this trip. So the promised C-130 landed, which is the smallest of the really large cargo planes, the kind that they load vehicles into. And by the way, by the grace of God, they were willing to let us fly back to Norfolk with them. I could finally take a breath. So we boarded, and then the 20-year-old pilot, okay, so he was probably a bit older, but not by much, came back into the cargo area of the plane where we sat in those red nets that you see people in actual military uniforms sitting in when they're flying to military places for military purposes. The 20-year-old pilot informed us that first we would be flying low so that they didn't have to pressurize the cabin, meaning the flight would take longer, but that if something were to happen, there were oxygen masks somewhere, and you operated them some way that wasn't really made clear, and that I could barely hear over the noise of the engines and the earplugs we all had in because, this wasn't Delta. So Mama Bear kicks in and starts to panic, thinking, oh my God, my baby boy is beside me, and this 20-year-old is flying us back in this cruise ship-sized plane, and he's promised to stay low enough so we can breathe the normal air, but he's like 20, so what are the odds that he's actually able to keep this beast at the correct altitude the entire flight? Then he gave the second announcement. The bathroom is the bucket over in the corner, and there's a curtain you can pull around it. What the bleep? And with those words, I didn't drink a sip of my water until I walked off that plane in Norfolk. At this point, we were only 1 or 2 days from the next rotator flight flying back into Jacksonville, a full week after we were originally supposed to leave. So had we not flown out on this C-130 into Norfolk and decided to wait for that next 737 to go back through Jacksonville, we would have been on that flight. And this is where things get even weirder. That rotator flight ended up going off the runway when it landed in Jacksonville, coming to a stop in the St. Johns River. You can't make this up. Several people were injured and taken to the hospital, but I believe that was the extent of it. Back in Norfolk, we could have booked a flight home on a commercial airline, but over my dead body was I giving up 1 ounce of control that I absolutely didn't have to do. So I rented a car and we drove home almost 500 miles and 8 hours of hard-earned freedom. Like I said earlier, this experience did not change me right away, but over time I started to see it more clearly. I started to see how little control I had. How I responded by panicking and searching for anything I could control, and just how much it affected me. I think age has helped, as it should, in grasping how little control we have over the world, circumstances, others, and even ourselves. But to be sure, the grasp for control is definitely human, and I'm sure something I'll battle as long as I'm on this earth. Hopefully, like with everything else I hope to become, I can at least say I tried my best and I made a real effort to grow and evolve into an acceptance of my total lack of any perceived control and truly trusting the one who is in control. This was the ultimate masterclass in not having any control. I literally could not change the situation, no matter how hard I tried. And I tried. Sometimes God answers prayers in ways we don't expect or even want. Trusting Him meant sitting in the discomfort, learning patience, and finding peace when the plans are upended. I went for a family visit, but I came back with a lesson in surrender that I will never forget. Control feels safe, but it's an illusion. Sometimes the most freeing thing we can do is loosen our grip and let God write the story. I can't tell you how many times I've experienced this lesson over and over again, but of course, like all of us, I find myself continuing to do it again and again, but at least now I can catch myself and I recognize what I'm doing and why I shouldn't do it, and can start to really make an effort to loosen that grip, to trust God through it, to find the silver lining or some aspect of a situation that I can find joy in. So if you're in a season where things feel out of your control, maybe it's not punishment, but it's preparation. I never expected Guantanamo Bay to be my classroom, but it taught me that trusting God is less about holding tight and more about letting go. Thanks for joining me on Charm and Circumstance. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and follow along on Instagram, because charm is personal and circumstance is what you make of it.